the folks that are dialing in right now, we'll get started in just a few minutes.
Welcome everybody who is gathering. We are going to give folks another minute or so and then we're going to get started. Okay, everybody. I see people are joining and we know this is your valuable time, so we are going to get started right now. Welcome and thank you so much for joining us this evening. It is a pleasure to be here with you tonight. My name is Rebecca Middleton and I am one of the founding members of WeWomenLead. WeWomenLead was formed in 2021 by 8 professional women with diverse cultural and business experiences who met in a women's executive leadership program through Cornell University. We came together as a collaboration of ideas, but we soon noticed that we had a real opportunity to build bridges, find common ground, and most importantly, impact the world and the greater good by demonstrating the power of women. You'll see all these lovely ladies on the screen, and it is my pleasure to introduce each of them. Nina Zerman, Ruth Voorhees, Marcel Rossman, Shauna McNamee, Shannon Rich, Allison Canigliaro Hubbard, and Joanna Colosimo. So why are we here today? Well, this date, March 24th, was chosen symbolically because it was Equal Pay Day for the US in 2021. For those of you who don't know, like me, this is a new topic. Equal Pay Day symbolizes how far into the year the average woman must work in order to have earned what the average man has earned the entire previous year. The good news is that for 2022, Equal Pay Day is actually March 15th in the US, a full 9 days ahead of where we were in 2021. However, to highlight that this is a global issue, I'm in Canada, as is Shauna, and I know many of our guests here, Equal Pay Day in Canada is April 12th, nearly a full month after our US colleagues. And we know that many women in countries around the world are far worse off than both US and Canada. Knowing this, we felt it was important to share actionable takeaways with our global networks on what you can do in your day-to-day role to address the pay gap, regardless of where you are. While much of the research you will hear tonight is US-based, the themes that we want you to take away are global in nature. The gender pay gap occurs in all countries and societies and across most professions, and it can prevent women from achieving economic independence and security. Our presenters tonight will discuss what the pay gap is, what it isn't, and root causes for the pay gap from a practical perspective, emphasis on practical. Additionally, they're going to discuss what pay equity is and how organizations can approach pay equity in a meaningful way. So without further ado, I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our incredible panelists tonight. Joanna Colosimo is the Vice President of Workforce Equity and Compliance Strategy at DCI Consulting, where she leads a division of IO Psychologist. For those of you who don't know, like me, IO is industrial organizational. advanced HR practitioners, and analysts who consult with organizations on pay equity solutions, compliance audit strategies, affirmative action, and diversity, equity, and inclusion. Joanna has extensive experience working with Fortune 1000 clients to conduct and interpret complex, adverse impact, utilization, diversity, and systemic pay equity analytics in the equal employment opportunity context. Our next presenter is Liz Bradley, a partner at Washington, D.C. based law firm, Fortney Scott. She has over 10 years of experience representing employers and federal contractors in litigation and mediation matters before state and federal agencies and courts, as well as counseling and training private, public, and nonprofit employers in all aspects of employment law, including pay equity and glass ceiling reviews. She served as a law clerk to the Honorable Ronald L. Buckwalter on the U.S. District Court for the Eastern District of Pennsylvania after graduating from the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. Ms. Bradley is admitted to practice in Washington, D.C. and Pennsylvania, as well as in various federal courts. And last but certainly not least, Dr. Lisa Harpe is an industrial psychologist and director of selection and assessment, principal consultant in the Employment and Litigation Services Division at DCI Consulting. In this role, Dr. Harpe assists companies in the evaluation of the fairness of their employment practices. This includes statistical and qualitative analysis of hiring, performance appraisal, compensation, and promotion practices, as well as coordination with attorneys and employers involved in discrimination litigation or Office of Federal Contract Compliance Program audits. She brings 20 years of expertise in industrial psychology and statistical analysis. Welcome to the panel, ladies. And Joanna, the mic is all yours.
Rebecca, thank you for that fantastic introduction. I'm so excited to be here, both as a WeWomenLead member, but also a pay equity advocate. And I'm really excited to have brought Liz and Lisa into this conversation. I've gotten to work with them in a very practical context for many years in various matters. I've gotten to present with them. And we are really here today because of everything Rebecca talked about in terms of we have done so much work in our professional lives regarding pay equity and diversity and the pay gap. We wanted to bring to this audience some awareness, some just education on basic terms, so that when you're making your own decisions and your own conclusions in the world, and you're evaluating news headlines or reading research or just a contributing member to society, that we all have some baseline knowledge of the pay gap and pay equity. Keep in mind, Liz, Lisa, and I all have very practical backgrounds, right? We're not looking at this like from a really macro level sociological perspective. We have a lot of experience helping companies and corporations not only defend discrimination lawsuits and pay, but also in a proactive context to help them with their diversity initiatives and their pay equity initiatives, actually probably more so in the proactive context for pay equity than anything else. So keep that in mind. We have this practical and research oriented background, and of course Liz has her legal background. So I'm excited to talk about this today. Our agenda, we're going to spend a little bit of time on the pay gap, what it is, what it isn't. We're going to spend a little time on distinguishing that from a pay equity, which is a different concept. These are two different terms. We want to make sure everybody, that's like foundational for us today, is to make sure everybody walks away with the difference between the pay gap and difference between pay equity. So we're going to talk a little bit more about pay equity studies, that legal framework, the analytical framework, what companies usually do with results. And then we want to talk a little bit holistically, like what do we see in our research and all of the thousands of pay equity studies that we've done as being holistic problems, when it comes to this issue. And then we're going to wrap it up with practical takeaways, like what can you do as either an individual contributor or a leader in your organization to help with this phenomenon. So I'm thrilled to talk with everybody. We're going to do a couple interactive things today. So the first thing we're going to do is a quick poll. So we're going to pull up a poll question in our administrator will do that for you. I'm not quite sure if it's on the screen yet, but you should get a poll prompting you on, in just a moment, your background. So your background helps us understand how the rest of the conversation is going to go today. So can anybody do a quick chat for me and let me know if you're seeing the poll come up?
Not yet, just a sec.
Okay.
Yeah, Joanna, it's not on yet.
Okay, no worries. So the poll answers, though, if you want to sneak peek, essentially we're looking to see, are you a leader in your organization? Do you have an HR background?
There we go.
There it is, first poll. So take a second and let's make sure you choose which one suits your background the best. Give it a few more seconds. Okay. Let's go ahead and see the results. Okay, so we have this is great. We have a mix of people. We have people with different backgrounds. We have people that are in leadership positions, owners, and professionals. Fantastic. So we're excited to have you all on the phone today. We'll talk from a general level and we'll give you some practical takeaways to hit each of these audiences at the end of the conversation. Thank you. All right, so I'm going to actually turn it over to Liz. And Liz, I would love for you to talk about the pay gap and pay equity in the news and the headlines that we see.
Absolutely. And I want to reiterate, and I know Joanna mentioned this, but use the chat box. We want to make this an active dialogue. So if we raise a question, if there's something that you want us to dig in more deeply, pop it in the chat box. We are all monitoring it. So the idea of this is to be very, very interactive. Okay, so why are we here? What are we talking about? It's everywhere. Discussions of wage gap and pay equity are in the news every single day. So, but what does this mean? Amazon says it pays women and men equally. Okay, what does that mean? Does that mean every male and female in their workplace is paid the exact same amount? No, we know that's an overly simplistic definition. But what we're going to be talking to you about today is how do you read these headlines and actually have knowledge behind what they're actually telling you or what they're not telling you? How does Facebook and Microsoft achieve pay equality? Pay equality, that's a big commitment that everybody in your workplace is being paid equally. How is that done? How is that? What does that mean? So this is what we're going to be looking at. There's also other statements that are made. On the next slide, we move on to is talking about Starbucks is committed to 100% gender pay equity. Again, is that saying that everybody is being paid exactly the same amount? No. So how can they make these statements? How can they put out in the public they've gotten to 100% pay equity, or you know they're close to it or even above? And that's what we're going to walk through today with you, is understanding what is a wage gap, what is an adjusted wage gap, because they're different, and then what actually is a pay equity analysis and what is that telling you. I'm going to preview a little bit for you, and what we say what they're talking about is a wage gap here, and there's lots of different ways you can look at that data to get to this 100%. Whether that, you know, and we'll talk through that. I'm going to turn it over to Lisa when we move on to that. So again, educationally, so that you're informed. So let's basic definitions. A pay gap. What do women make compared to men in a company? Overall, on average, what are you saying? What this is most of these is looking at the average income of women compared to the average income of men. And is there a gap? Pretty basic. But let's think about, does that mean that there is a problem with compensation? Not necessarily. So overly simple example. You have an entry level, you have a company of two, an entry level person and your founder, CEO, the top. If they are not paid the exact same amount, you have a pay gap. Okay, but their duties, responsibilities, etc. are very different. So simply having a pay gap does not necessarily mean that you are not being paid, you're paying individuals inequitably, or that you're paying them unfairly, or that there's any problem in your comp system. So a wage gap in and of itself is not necessarily an issue. What's pay equity? Pay equity is there a difference between men and women in similarly situated jobs, accounting for job related factors? So that is looking at peers within in a group of employees and saying, are men being paid more than women performing similar job? That's where a nudge comes in, and there's an issue with your compensation system. That's where potential discrimination occurs. And is there inequity in your compensation among peers? You could go, we're just going to circle back around and compare pay equity to wage gap here. If you have a workforce where you absolutely have pay equity among peers, so everybody performing the same job is paid exactly the same at every single level, and you have that equity among peers, no problem with discrimination or inequity among peers in your pay system, but you very well may still have a pay gap. And that goes down to a bit of a distribution we're going to talk about in the workforce. So going back to, you can have complete pay equity and still have a wage pay gap. But just because you have a pay gap does not mean that you have inequities in your compensation. So a bit of a circular piece here, and I see Joanna's coming off mic, so I know she wants to chime in here for a moment.
No, and that's fantastic, Liz, right? It's the difference between, on average, we took all the males and all the females and we took their average pay. That's the pay gap. Pay equity is looking at role to role comparisons. People are in similarly situated jobs, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so we had a great question. Remember, the wage gap was about 18% for certain groups of women. How is 18% determined? We're going to get there. Great question. Yep. But one thing I wanted to call out here is that for the purpose of most of the rest of our presentation, we're going to compare males to females, right? We're talking about the gender wage gap. We women lead. That is the focus of today. But the same principles are applicable to other groups, right? To minority subgroups. You can take the same conversation. The gap is a little different in terms of the percentages, but you can take the same concepts and apply them to different groups. What are we seeing with white employees compared to Black employees, and so on and so forth. So very conceptually similar. Great conversation. Lisa, anything else to add before we move forward?
No, I'm waiting to explain what that 18% means. So hopefully that will be answered soon.
She's so excited. We're so excited to get there. So I actually have questions. So I'm going to kind of tee it up. So Lisa and Liz, and I'll let you all tag team this a little bit. And Lisa, you can start first if you want. What is the pay gap? What does a pay gap study really tell us about a company or an industry's pay practices, right? We could get broader here, but let's focus on a company itself. So if a company is publishing their pay gap, what is that really telling us about pay equity or pay practices? And then how does that differ from a pay equity study and what that reveals? And then we're going to talk a little bit about how that's interpreted.
Yeah, so really a pay gap does not necessarily tell you a lot about the specific pay practices within a company, but that doesn't mean it's not useful for interpreting other kinds of things about your company. And so what we've got on here is the actual calculation. So come down to math with me. I love math, but this is the only calculation you'll see in this presentation. But I did want to just show it to you. So it's a very simple calculation. But I think one of the biggest things you have to understand is that it is an aggregated calculation. And so when you hear that women are paid, the wage gap is 18% between men and women. The Bureau of Labor Statistics gathers a lot of information about what people across the country make. They take everybody in that population and they calculate the median women's earnings and the median men's earnings. And in essence, it's a ratio of those two. And so the actual calculation you can see here is that difference between men's median and women's median earnings divided by the men's median earnings. So really, it's a very aggregate number. It doesn't differentiate anything about jobs or experience or education. So it really gives us kind of an overall look. And companies have taken this now, and a lot of companies are calculating these same kinds of pay gaps, likely because we're kind of used to hearing that, in the US, women make 82 cents on the dollar to men. And so then we've seen a lot of companies starting to say, okay, well, how do we look? And so that's kind of where that calculation came from. But I'm going to talk in a few minutes about another type of pay gap that gives you a different piece of information. Before I get there, this is just an example. And you can look at different kinds of compensation. Most typically, companies either look at base salary or total compensation. And so here we've got an example. In the first one, the women on average make $83,000 compared to the men who make $100,000. So again, it's just the ratio of that woman's pay to the men's pay. So women make 83 cents on the dollar in that example. And to Joanna's point, although we're focusing on gender, you can do these kind of analyses using other demographic information. And so another example, looking at race, here is just all minorities on average, $90,000 compared to non-minorities on average making $95,000. So the pay gap would be minority employees make 95 cents on the dollar to the non-minorities. So again, it's a very simple calculation, which is appealing, but I think you just have to really understand that it is across jobs. It doesn't account for any differences in merit type variables. And then the other example, because this is probably what you see more often coming from companies, and this is an adjusted pay gap. And I think it's really important to understand that differentiation, because what we see companies do, and we do a lot of these type of studies, is I mentioned that, kind of just that overall female to male pay gives you that unadjusted wage gap, but we can use statistical techniques to control or account for job title, location, other structural variables. And in essence, after controlling for that, what is that ratio? And so that's when you see, companies like Facebook and Google or Microsoft publish that females make 100 cents, or 100 cents on the dollar to males. We have a 1-to-1 ratio. Females, there's no pay gap at all. But one of the things that's a little unknown, and I think companies are starting to have some pressure to start publishing more of this, is what is controlled for. And so even on this list, you may have one company that controls for just job. You may have another company that controls for 15 different variables, job and location and performance and tenure. And so I think that's something just to understand, in particular, that there is a difference. So it's not that Facebook is better than the US as a whole because it's the pay gap is 100%. It's that they've adjusted for all these other underlying factors that unadjusted wage gap hasn't adjusted for.
And I think I just like to call out, this is sort of the key driver for the title of the presentation. I know some people asked, like, what do you mean by a tale of two pay gaps? And that this was the dichotomy, right? Lisa and Liz, it was unadjusted, what we typically see from Bureau of Labor Statistics, or when we observe equal pay day, is usually an unadjusted wage gap, right? It's just that average salary comparison. And then a lot of companies have been very savvy about, when they're disclosing, to Liz's point and to Lisa's point, that they are using control variables to adjust for and account for, because their view of the matter is, well, we need to account for nuances in job, and we need to control for that in a study, and we need to account for the fact that we pay people differently in different geographies or different grades or whatever else the case may be. So Lisa, I think you hit on this. We don't know what's necessarily in all of these studies that are published, or we can't say them publicly, right? But if anybody that's a savvy reader that's looking in the news, you might be able to start picking up on this nuance when a company publishes their pay gap, because I've seen it done really well in the tech industry from their PR company. They'll say, we have pay parity for men and women after accounting for job title or roles in our company. That's an indicator that they've controlled for job title in their study. They've controlled for role or level in their study. So those little nuances and press releases is something that you'd want to read through so you can understand, what is really being reported.
Yeah. And a few companies that have actually achieved it unadjusted have actually called it out in their narrative. We have an unadjusted, they're screaming that because that addresses things more than comp. And we're going to get to that in one moment about what else is being shown in this data.
And actually, Liz, great setup. And so I have a fun story to tell. I don't know if it's fun, but in the 2016, 2017 era, we saw a lot of tech companies that you saw on the previous screen, tech industry, start to have that public pressure to disclose their pay gap, their gender pay gap, their other pay gaps for representing white employees to minority employees. And they did, right? And they came out with all of the data that you saw on the prior screen. We're at 100%, we're 1-to-1 ratios, we have pay parity. And they got a lot of pushback from shareholder groups and advocacy groups. So what you'll see on the screen is a quote. She's no longer there, but from AAUW's VP of Government Relations in a hearing on Capitol Hill, Lisa Matz said, okay, a lot of companies are reporting this lack of gender pay gap, this 1-to-1 ratio, this 100% in the dollar, but it's not telling us the full story of what's going on in your company. It's very clear that the broader issue, and this is again a women's advocacy group, it's very clear that maybe the data is accurate for what it tells it to be, but it's very clear that women are underrepresented in fields, in technology fields or in leadership positions. And one thing that we all want to convey here is that from a practical experience, we see that, right? Liz and Lisa and I see that in the data often is that dichotomy. So this is a great setup, Liz, for just chatting a little bit about how occupation does play a role.
And this is where I love to spend my time. So this is what a pay gap is telling us, because for the most part, I think there's a lot of companies are working to get to the problem of not paying peers equitably, right? So what is a wage gap really telling us? Well, inequity between peers is a smidge of that. The real comes in this: your occupation. Where is your workflow? Where is your workforce? And where are you paying your employees? So higher level positions, certain STEM positions, they are being paid more. And what is your demographic breakdown in those higher paying positions? Whether they're higher seniority C-suite, or are we talking where the market is demanding higher pay within all ranks of our workforce? And you'll see these numbers are showing us what the gender comparison is based in US wide, based on various types of roles. So female is the green. If you can't read that, male is the orange. And we will see that there are more men in architecture. The bottom one is architecture, engineering managers, significantly more men than females moving up the chart. Flip that around, you'll see there's significantly more women in child care workers, hosts and hostess, personal care aides. So these types of data and this workforce, or the occupational rollout, is what's really the underlying issue in causing the wage gap. And then the way you look at this is if you see this actually in your workforce, and we have a sample that shows this is a general market data, but if actually you look at what's happening, and this is a sample company that we used, that you can see the dividing line where the percentage of males jumps up to that senior level / professional, and the percent representation of women drops. There's your wage gap. That's your wage gap. It is not a compensation issue. It's a workforce distribution issue. It's getting women into senior levels of leadership or in higher paying professions that the market is driving. So that is, and what really I think employers need to be looking at is doing detailed glass ceiling analysis, or I think I've heard them called broken rung analyses. And this is, don't just look at comp. That is just the first piece of it. I want to look at your voluntary terminations. Where are women and minorities leaving your workforce? At what level? Are they saying, yep, I know there's no future for me at this company above this level, so I've gotten the experience I need at your company, and I'm going to take that and I'm going to go somewhere else where they're going to advance me, where I'm going to get that movement up. I want to look at your promotion data. How are you building those slates? What are you doing to develop women and minority in the lower positions, or in encouraging them by providing educational system, training system? What are you doing to bring women into those higher level positions? And I could spend an entire hour here, and I know Joanna's probably telling me to wrap it up here, but I think the one single takeaway that I think is important from this is, when you hear pay gap, don't go to you have to adjust compensation. Go to you have to adjust your workforce distribution. You've got to bring women up. So this is my little, I could spend a day here. I apologize.
No, don't. And Liz, I mean, this is a great example. So from a practical perspective, I agree with everything you said. I cannot tell you how many instances that I have partnered with an organization that was hyper focused on their wage gap because they wanted to go public with the results. And so we did I'm setting up Lisa for the next conversation. We did a very robust pay equity study. We're like,
Yep.
okay, let's dig into your comp practices. Let's see where your potential problems are. We're finding, at your organization, an 80 cents to the dollar unadjusted difference. Did this whole study, spent a ton of time trying to fix pay problems, looking at their pay systems, looking at their grade structures, looking at movements, adjusting for tenure. And they had like two problems, like two people that need to be adjusted. And, their CEO or their C-suite is, well, I need answers. Give me, for instance, it's like, well, we need to do a glass ceiling review, because what I'm thinking is happening is that you don't have enough women in leadership. You don't have enough minorities in leadership. You don't have them in your higher paying jobs. And that is exactly what happened. And that is exactly where this slide kind of came from. And that story just needs to kind of continue to be told, because it happens over and over and over again. So go ahead.
Well, there's one question in the chat I want to address.
Oh, yeah.
So it says, and we acknowledge that data is a little outdated. It was from 2015. There have not been significant movements. We do expect to get more updated data with the new census results that are coming out. But what's interesting is there's a question on whether there'll be impacts seen when COVID years start appearing in the available data. I think women are coming out of the workforce again. They had to care for families, homeschooling kids. So I'm concerned about the way that society values women in the workforce, and a lot of women had to step out of the workforce as a result of COVID years and what is happening. So we may get more updated data out of the census, but it may be immediately outdated with women stepping out based on COVID reasons. So not sure what that data is going to show, but just to answer that question about the outdated data.
And
The only thing I'll add on that is that I do think that, kind of related to that, there's some fields where there has been such a labor shortage that there's pressure to raise the pay of some of these predominantly dominated female jobs, childcare workers, teachers, some of those. So there are some wage issues with specific types of jobs that we're seeing.
And I'll slightly chime in here, and we could do another session on here. There's another thread we should think about too, is there's a lot of push in this administration to increase the use of unions and having union employees. A lot of the infrastructure work requiring certain union agreements at certain levels of financial. Unions are predominantly men. So I'm, concerned about some of those roles and how that could impact women and representation in certain those jobs, because those jobs will have pretty competitive pay based on some federal funding issues. So just side note on that, and then I'll let us move on.
And I'll just have one final note to Helen and Christine's point on COVID related issues. SHRM, the Society for Human Resource Management, actually recently published a really nice article leveraging various research organizations to essentially say, yeah, we're actually seeing an impact of female not only representation in the workforce, but it is impacting take-home pay. And there is some projections it'll take years to kind of overcome the impact of COVID. I mean, one thing to think about though is keep in mind, we went from 82 on a macro level outside of a company perspective. We went to a lot of published research last year was saying in the US, it was 82 cents to the dollar. This year it's 83 cents. I've seen a lot of the research saying 83 cents. So it's an interesting thing to monitor on at the macro level, what's going to happen in the COVID impact. So it's a great question.
One other question is, what role, if any, can governments and elected officials do to help address this issue?
Liz, great question. They're leading us into our next conversation.
Exactly.
And so before we get to that question, do you mind if we hit our poll real quickly?
Nope.
And then we're going to go to that, because
I was teeing it up.
You were teeing up. There is so much that governments and elected officials are trying to do to get at this issue, and perhaps not all of them are fruitful. Okay, so next poll question do you think the pay gap affects you? Super simple. Yes, no, or not sure yet. Just kind of monitoring how you feel about the issue at this point in our presentation. Give it a moment. Do you think the pay gap affects you? Okay, let's look at the results. Most people said yes. A lot of people said not sure or no. And those are actually fairly appropriate responses, right? Because you may not feel like this directly impacts you if you're in a higher paying position in your workforce or something else. So I think that's fair that we have a diversity of responses after kind of talking through this. So great discussion. We do want to turn a little bit for a moment to talk about pay equity, because this is a foundational concept in the overall conversation around pay. And so, Liz, I'd love for you to tee up the legal framework of pay equity and a little bit how that's different than the pay gap.
Okay. And lawyer here, I will not spend too much time here, but there's some general concepts, and there are, to that question, what can the government do? So Title VII, that prohibits discrimination on the basis of race, gender, various protected classes in compensation. So you cannot make pay decisions and pay more than women based on their race or gender. That's gender. So that's often, you see claims will be brought under Title VII. That is looking at the general concept of similarly situated employee groups, which is a little bit broader than what's looked at under Equal Pay Act. And Equal Pay Act really gets more narrowed in and prohibits paying differently for employees who are similar conditions at the same level skill. Equal Pay Act more gets to almost nose to nose is where they try to get that. Title VII allows a little more deviation based on prior experience, more of the focus on the softer education, prior experience, responsibility level, although that pays into Equal Pay Act. So the two laws are slightly different but often overlap. The OFCCP, that is a division of the Department of Labor that governs federal contractors. So often enhanced requirements are placed on federal contractors that they cannot get put through Congress for general employment. For example, minimum wage. There's been some attempts to raise the general minimum wage across the U.S. Couldn't get that through, but there is a higher minimum wage required for federal contractors. Concept is, if you want to take federal funds, then we're going to put these additional contractual obligations on you as part of the federal contracting process. Within those obligations, OFCCP does require that federal contractors assess their compensation systems for any areas of disparity. So it's putting, not necessarily those words, but there's some softness around what you have to do. So there is this heightened requirement, and federal contractors are required to assess their comp system. When they are audited by the Department of Labor, OFCCP, their comp is looked at closely, and they run analyses of all types of different groupings, from broad analysis by your EEO1 category, so all your professionals, how are they being paid, and is there disparities? And they do start looking at that, and they hold contractors accountable to that. They make you justify those differences. They want that detailed information. They will go to conciliation or enforcement on those differences. So that is one way in which the government is attempting to address it within a population that they have that jurisdiction over in the contracting law. State laws, there's a lot. I think every state, almost not, that's a lot of states have state laws that govern pay. I think one of the biggest ones that's helping this issue is the ban on using prior salary as a basis for setting, right? So all these things about what you're supposed to report, but what's getting to the root cause of this? Well, if men have traditionally been paid more and you come into a new job, and because my prior employer was underpaying me, I get underpaid at my next employer. So I think that there's many state bans that prohibits asking that or relying on it in any way in setting in salary. And I think that's one of the best foots forward that I've seen, and that's where we need to start getting to root cause solutions in that piece. And international laws. So can't sit here and give the litany there, but there are many countries have obligations of reporting their wage gap. There's differences whether it's adjusted versus unadjusted, and whether or not you need to report what's in that. So that's just to give you the legal landscape. So, and we'll quickly move off because I know we are coming up. I know I'm running a little long.
All good. And I would just offer, Liz, that there are a variety of jurisdictions in Canada. I know like
Correct.
Toronto has an equal pay, like Ontario.
Yes.
So I just offer that for our audience there. And they all kind of borrow from each other. It feels like the legal framework, California and Oregon and Washington all borrow from each other. And, Canada is not far behind as well. They look to see what the US is doing in local jurisdictions as well. So very interesting. Lisa, tell us a little bit more about the analytical framework of pay equity and how that's just very different about what we talk about with a pay gap.
Sure. And so I'll follow up with what was said in terms of, I know that, I think that Joanna and Liz and I, being in the US, come from a US centric perspective, but all of these concepts apply regardless of what country you're in terms of, looking at a pay gap, what information that tells you, conducting a good pay equity study, how you do that. And so I do just want to kind of give a little context in that. But this is very different than a pay gap study. So I think I mentioned pay gap study, relatively easy to calculate. It's an aggregate look, whether that be company-wide or country-wide, if you're doing the unadjusted one at least. But when you get to a pay equity study, the concept here is that you really want to make sure that you're paying people who are doing similar types of work in a similar manner. And so that means that we're going to break people down. We're not going to look at it company-wide. The first key point of this is really identifying that appropriate grouping. And, we mentioned Title VII, Equal Pay Act, and their state regulations, their country regulations. But in essence, what you want to do is really think about who does similar things, similar levels of responsibility, requiring similar skills and levels of effort. So that could be at a job title level, it might be at a job family level, but really spending some time to say, given everything else being held constant, who should be paid the same? And so that's one of those key components of a pay equity study. And you're going to do analyses by those groups. You're going to have one analysis per group. And then another key component of that is really identifying what are the job related factors that influence pay. So once you look, you say, these people do similar types of things, they should be paid differently. Well, they're not all paid the same. What would explain those differences? And then you're talking about things like tenure, prior experience, specific skill sets. So what are the factors that we need to think about and control for among those in similar groups? And then you want to identify the appropriate analytic method, which is one of the things that I do. And so whether that's running, multiple regressions or small group analyses, really trying to identify how are we going to analyze these groups. Then you, of course, analyze the data. And then one of the key points here, though, is that whenever you do these studies, analyzing the data is not the end. So inevitably, particularly if you've got a lot of groups you're looking at, there are going to be some groups that you identify as having some differences. And so at that point, that doesn't mean you've discriminated. It means let's go into these groups and investigate them, because inevitably you don't have all the data you need to control for all the factors that differentiate pay within a group. And so you want to go in and start identifying, is there some common factor we didn't control for? Are there individual reasons for individual different people? And so only after you've done that investigation, and then sometimes you do identify a set of people and you say, we don't know why they're paid the way they're paid. And that's when you start talking about what kind of adjustments should we make for those individuals.
Mhm.
And so I think that, and to me, a good pay equity study is kind of, I think Liz mentioned this, is foundational before you can really start thinking about, changing your workforce representation and other kind of more macro level type policies or practices that may influence pay. You really need to make sure that people who are doing similar work are being paid fairly. And that's really the concept behind a pay equity study.
Yep. A couple things to think about here. Oh, sorry, Joanna.
I was gonna throw a question at you, Lisa. So we had a really good question about how do you control for things like tenure when certain professions have been dominated by men, even without taking into account prior salary. So I think maybe just like re-hitting the SSE, the pay group conversations. The question is, how do you control for things like tenure when professions have historically been dominated by men?
Yeah, and so the concept here would be that within a similarly situated group. So it's once again, we're breaking these down. So you might have, I'm going to look at my software engineer level ones. It might be that specific because they all do similar type work. So within that group, you should be able to control for what prior experience did those people have in software engineering that might explain those pay differences. And if, to your point, maybe men have more experience, they've been, because of they're male dominated, and that may explain some of the pay disparities, then that raises you to a different level of how do you tackle that kind of issue. But here we're really talking about a very refined analysis where we're looking to make sure people are paid fairly.
And let me add on to that for a minute, Joanna. To that point, I'm working with a client right now who says time and job really shouldn't impact, right? After you've been in the job for the first year, right? Once, first you get a little paid a little less, but once you're in it, so we don't control, for example, we would not control tenure, like, depending on the certain dates, because we don't want to control for that and that be an explanatory factor. Because if we don't think our comp structure should be paying based on that, then that's going to make those people a high outlier, and we're going to look at them and probably red circle them. Usually you don't bring their pay down, but those people are, and you look to see how people can be up for that. Real quick, and I want to touch base on this, is all you have to be careful what factors you put in. Performance. Do you really pay for performance? And could that be what's called a tainted variable? Do you have managers who are overrating males to females? I would always start, before you put something like performance into a regression to explain comp, you better be looking at those and making sure you're not having an inappropriately large amount of men being highly ranked, because that just is a way to hide a discriminatory practice in your pay. So be very careful looking at that. Sorry.
And the other advantage of these pay equity studies is the idea is to model how pay is enforced in your company. And so you really can start kind of identifying, do we really understand how we pay people? And then if we can control for those, is that really explaining how people are paid? So it does kind of give you some information about, from a policy and procedure perspective, do we have good policies and procedures? Does the data suggest that we're actually, following those?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. That was actually my point, Lisa, was, hey, our whole purpose here is to model the pay system.
That's right.
And if the pay system, to Liz's point, has tainted factors because of other things like performance, if performance is tainted or something else, we don't want to always rely on those in a pay equity study. Exactly. And that's actually something that we discuss a lot with enforcement agencies, right, Liz? As we might argue over what is a tainted or not tainted factor and all of that. But that's a really good point, because in the reality and practical context, we want to model a compensation system. If the organization pays a little bit more for a master's degree than the bachelor's degree, and that's a consistently applied policy,
And
well,
it's a job-related
job
skill.
related, we want to account for that nuance in this kind of discussion, right? So just keep that in mind. And Lisa, talk a little bit about what companies do with results typically.
Yeah, so, and I already alluded to this, but you got to remember the goal here is equity, comparing people in the same types of jobs. So it is different than that pay gap comparison. And again, they're both important. They're just answering different questions. And so, as I mentioned, once you run these initial studies, it's critical that you do those investigations. And that is one of the biggest things that I have to try to talk to clients about early on, is make sure you've got the resources available to do those investigations, because it's going to take some time. And so once you've investigated those outliers, you've investigated those differences, that's really when you have that really leftover subset of people that you say, yep, they're just paid low and I don't know why. And it's very satisfying for companies to kind of explain some and then get to those ones and say, we're going to make these adjustments.
Yeah.
And so that's really the goal of what you want to do with these results.
Yeah. One little piece here is this investigation is mandatory. Making adjustments based on statistics alone is going to get you into a lot of legal trouble, right? Unless you truly have essentially a unionized workforce and everybody is lockstep, you have to be doing that individualized assessment. The other thing that I often see people do wrong, which is going to get you in trouble, you do an analysis. You have a bunch of low outliers. You cannot explain those low outliers. You have men and women who are low outliers. And so you adjust the women. What have you just done? You've made a pay decision based on race that was contrary to the men. You have now discriminated against men in your compensation practices. So be very careful that everything is done in an equitable manner. And that's one of the biggest places that I often see a lack of understanding that you have to do everything equitably. So keeping that in mind. And to the one final point is, make sure before getting into one of these, if you do this analysis and you come out with this knowledge that there are inequities in your workforce that are potentially based as a result of discrimination, but you don't have the budget to fix it, you now have a knowing violation. You knowingly have discrimination in your workforce. So employers, when they start these, they have to have the budget to do the necessary fixes.
Yeah. Don't start a pay equity study unless you plan to do something with the results, for sure.
Absolutely.
Great. Ladies, great discussion. So let's talk a little bit more about the root cause of pay issues as we have seen them in the practical context, as we've done thousands of pay equity studies and wage gap studies. And I just really, Liz and Lisa, really want your perspective. I know I have a perspective, but what should we be doing if we look at pay holistically and we look at how pay impacts gender or race? What are savvy organizations doing? What should they be looking at as they evaluate this in a holistic perspective?
Yeah, and I think that's where, I mentioned it's not that a wage gap analysis is better than a pay equity analysis or vice versa, as much as they tell you different things about your organization. And so they can be important parts of kind of this holistic view, but there are other components. So I think, beyond that, and we're seeing a lot more companies move in this direction of saying, okay, we want to do the statistical analysis, but we want to go beyond base or total comp. We want to look at bonuses and merit and starting salary. We want to look at the distribution of talent across the different paying jobs. So who's in the highest paying jobs and the lowest paying jobs. And we want to look at our policies and procedures, and we want to make sure that they are followed, that they're documented, and that employees understand them as well. And so we're seeing a lot more companies kind of take this more holistic look to really kind of root out and identify where there could be inequities.
Yeah. And I think, what back to the root cause issue is, yes, I mean, doing these analyses need to be done, but what do companies really do boots on the ground in order to solve the problem? It's not throwing money into your comp system. That's not it. It's looking at those talent distribution analysis. It's one circle on here, but get involved with your community, develop STEM programs, make sure that you're making sure that we have the pipeline of diverse workers, women and minorities coming in with the interest into STEM programs, or knowing that they can achieve and get past that glass ceiling, and that the C-suite is going to be diverse across race and gender. Getting there internally, spending that time and effort into developing your internal talent, giving them leadership training or specialty skill training, whatever it is, to get into the avenues of their workforce that are going to allow them to achieve both professionally and within their compensation realm. So, you know, it gets to me because the wage gap is not a compensation issue, and that is just the drum that I continually beat, that it is it's talent distribution and taking steps to correct that.
Great. And I echo everything you ladies said from my experience. I left college very passionate about the pay gap and very excited about the work that I was going to do in my life and my career as an IO psychologist. And the more pay equity studies that I did, let's be transparent, pay equity is table stakes. There are pay equity issues that exist that need to be corrected and addressed. But to overcome the majority of what we see pay gaps in organization, it does tend to be representation issues, and representation in higher paying positions, into STEM positions, to Liz's point, to leadership positions. So it's such a critical factor. So in my head, from a holistic perspective, pay equity is table stakes. Doing the pay equity analysis that Lisa described and your organization is something you should be doing every year. And then the rest of it all comes together. I would say in the next few years, organizations are probably going to have pressure to start posting their unadjusted wage gaps. And you're going to see more public disclosures of pay and diversity data, their diversity and their representation data based on shareholder pressure in the coming years. It's very common. It's going to continue to be common. And we're going to see the pay gap, diversity numbers, and representation in that same conversation and as we see the next 10 years go, and it's going to be commonplace for most industries. So that's my prediction for the future. But for the folks on the phone, before we turn to our final questions, what can you do about it? What can you as an individual or a company representative do about this? If you are an individual contributor and you don't have influence over your company's policies or procedures, understanding your market worth, understanding what your salary pay ranges are is a great start. Understanding if you are getting paid appropriately is a great start in making sure you're advocating for yourself. Great place to start. If you are an organizational representative, making sure you're complying with basic state, local, and international and domestic laws is important when it comes to pay equity. If you're an organizational leader, making sure you're advocating internally for an annual pay equity study. As I said, I think that's table stakes. Every organization, whether you're a federal contract or not, should be doing an annual evaluation of pay equity. And then to Liz's point, ensuring that there's actually budget available to do something with that data is important if you're a leader and you're in finance or whatever your role is. And then the last two strategies are really related to that holistic takeaway of the representation problem: recruiting, promoting diverse candidates in organizational roles. And Liz, I love the development of internship programs, co-ops, STEMs, because you can't always choose what somebody's career was 40 years ago, but we as companies have a corporate responsibility to bring in fresh, diverse talent into our higher paying roles. And I think that is something that if you're a corporate leader, you can definitely advocate for in terms of representation in the EDI or DEI context. So with that, we have wrapped up, and we would love to take the last few questions. And there are so many great questions. I want to make sure I got here's one, Q&A. I know there is always a promotion of women into high wage jobs like those found in STEM, but the reality is many women are drawn to education, childcare, healthcare. What we can do, advocate for fields that are women dominated? That's a great question. It's really hard to overcome a market-based society, right? In the US, we live in a market-based society. So I think that's a fantastic question, because I think it's going to take a lot more beyond a company, just one, a company or a series of companies, to start to move the needle on occupations that are considered like lower on the wage scale. It's a macro level issue. And Lisa, you hit on this a little bit with COVID. how are we starting to value jobs as a society? Do we start setting other regulatory standards for different industries? Is something to think about, but that's a hard one because we are a market-based society, and it's going to take a lot of people and a lot of movement and strategy to remove the occupational
And I
domination
thought about that
issue.
because even that chart where you had the distribution of the high paying jobs and the low paying jobs. And so there are two ways to close the pay gap that way. One is move women into the higher paying jobs. The other is pay women dominated jobs more. And I think that, you know, to do that, you're absolutely right. It's going to have to be almost a movement. I mean, it's going to have to be government, companies, you know, citizens demanding it. And, you know, it is frustrating because I think you saw some of that when COVID first hit, and there was all this, you know, our teachers don't make enough and we need to raise their pay. And then it kind of fizzled out. And I wish I had the answer for how to keep some of those conversations going, but.
So here, I'm gonna interject real quick. I know we want to end on time, and it is almost 8 p.m. Eastern Daylight Savings Time. I am willing. We had so many questions. I'm willing to stay on. I don't know. We Women Lead leaders, shoot me a note if you're willing to stay on 5 minutes later. If you need to go and you have attended all that you can and you need to go to something else, thank you for joining us. Feel free to drop. I'd love to stay on for 5 to 10 more minutes to answer our questions that we did get. So folks that need to drop, thanks for coming. We're so happy to have had you, and thanks for giving us your time. And then we're going to transition to more questions. Liz, did you want to add to that last question?
I was gonna transition to another question because I was trying to try to get them answered before the end. But if we're staying on, we can pause a moment.
Well, so here's a really good one. Are there any laws or federal recommended practices against paying new hires a lot more than existing workers?
So laws, no. I mean, so if the basis for making it is unique skills or market demand, we have to now pay X amount more because this is the hot need, or our business needs to up that, and there's not availability in the marketplace, and I have to pay them more. No, that is not an unlawful reason to pay somebody more. Does it cause a lot of issues in your comp system? Yes. What a good practice would be, if that needs to happen, is some employers are saying, well, we won't give you more salary. We're going to keep you within the salary range of your peers. But that is when hiring bonuses come in, or stock awards, or other sort of forms of incentive pay, because they don't want to start messing with their base pay, and they know that that will only drive the disparity between those employees, and will only get bigger. So, but no, unfortunately, there's no law preventing that.
And there was a nice related comment question on that, which is, you know, and I'm aware of this, that it seems like we're in a time when the best way to raise your pay is to change companies.
Right.
And if you stay with the same company and just stay with them, you aren't rewarded as much. And that, I don't know the research on it, but it wouldn't surprise me to see females staying more than job hopping compared to men.
Yep. And let me clarify, under the Equal Pay Act, if we're really talking about two people coming in to the exact same job with the exact same responsibilities, and they truly are two perfectly overlapping, responsibilities, and you can't distinguish from them, yes, that would be an issue if you were to pay if it was a female coming in over men, or I'm sorry, a man coming in over women, that would be an issue under the Equal Pay Act.
So next good question. I'm hoping I'm getting to all of them. What can HR leaders do to proactively help encourage male executives to move on this? So I have a lot of thoughts here. Mine come into play because of actually having to present to a C-suite, or multiple C-suites actually, in terms of wage gap numbers, and a lot of this comes down to money. I'll just be really practical. I'll cut to the chase. Like, diversity sells. You don't want to have a wage gap. You don't want shareholder pressure. There's so much shareholder pressure right now on companies to disclose their wage gap, to disclose their diversity numbers. And, you don't want to lose a whole bunch of money to be known as the bad actor that either didn't publish or has a 65 cents to the dollar wage gap for their female to male workforce, which I've personally had to deal with, and I'll just leave it there. But you don't want to be that company. It's not good in this marketplace. So for me, there's like a natural business imperative of we can translate this to dollar and cents, the goodwill of the industry, your corporate responsibility aspect, and then just really your shareholder accountability. It's going to come in the next 10 years. We are going to see so much more shareholder pressure and public pressure to disclose this number. So you might as well get proactive about it and start embedding good practices today.
I mean, your EEO1 reports maybe include having this information, what's going to happen with that, whether that may become public. There's the concept of being transparent with your pay practices. It's coming. It's going to be out there, and I would want to get ahead of it now under privilege and get your house righted before you're forced to be public with it.
Yep.
There's also a question there about state laws on pay transparency and putting salary ranges, and if that's helping drive change and improvement. I absolutely think so. Colorado, for example, really interesting. They have a broad, and we'll see if there's any challenges to it, but their requirement is putting the salary ranges, even if a job doesn't report into Colorado or anybody in Colorado, but the person happens to be physically, all this work from home. So they're taking the position that their requirement that you post salary range in position descriptions, job postings. I think that definitely helps. It gives clear messaging about what the pay ranges are. Your peers can see it. They know when somebody's applying for that job, what everybody could be hired in at. I also think that may drive people to start looking at and having more knowledge about what their chosen career path may pay. And that's going to open up your eyes, knowing that certain of these positions that women tend to be driven to in a way are lower paying, and they can start seeing what some other types of opportunities are out there and help them make decisions that would move them into the higher pay brackets.
Great.
Ranking years.
And we're quickly monitoring any other questions that are coming in. Definitely help us out if we're missing stuff.
So there's a question here about rank and years of service. Everyone gets the same depending on where they are on a matrix. Sure. Okay, that's a really regimented pay structure. And depending on the type of job, yes, that works. It also significantly it doesn't motivate employees to work harder. If you are in a pay for performance type business where you want people to lead and achieve and excel, paying everybody the exact same way does not motivate your employees. So I don't think that is really the solution to addressing pay equity, is putting everybody into a regimented box.
Got it. And I think we had a similar question about a pay scale for military work for all industries. And I think it's going to be hard for certain industries. Like you said, Liz, there are some pay for performance industries, like your production. I've worked with a lot of production, like you get paid for your piece rate, how fast you fold a piece of laundry or something. So I don't think it's applicable to all industries, but some industries could borrow from it, depending on what it is.
But that's not where the issue is. But that's not what the issue is. The issue is usually in our salaried population who are outside of those scales, and it's getting women into those senior leadership roles and into those other positions. It's really not on that peer-to-peer issue where the wage gap lives.
Yeah, and I tend to agree with that as well. I mean, the last 20 years, companies and corporations and industries have really tightened up in their salary grade structures. Like they have organizations, I don't know if people realize, organizations have really tight compensation standards. They're very aware of equal pay laws. They've gotten rid of negotiation. Organizations have spent the last 20 years really trying to tighten up on this issue. And we see it in pay equity studies. There are sometimes issues that have lingered over time, but I think you're right, Liz, that the representation issue is king here. So I think we were asked to kind of start to wrap up to give people their evenings back. We so appreciated your time tonight, and we are happy to share this presentation. I know WeWomenLead will distribute this, we'll have a recording of the session or the slides. So we're so excited that you're able to join. If you have questions, Liz, Lisa, and I are always happy to answer questions offline and just talk. This is one of our absolute favorite topics. We want to watch the wage gap go away for minorities and females, and we want to empower people with great knowledge to help make that happen.
Mhm.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.